there's a potential wide receiver trade floating around there that maybe the Pittsburgh Steelers are interested in. We have talked Romeo Doubs, potentially Alan Lazard. Some have brought up Brandon Ayuk for another go round here ever since George Pickens got traded. And there's been back and forth constantly about if the Pittsburgh Steelers are going to replace George Pickens, if they're going to give this the same go round that they went last year when they tried to get Brandon Ayuk. And if it doesn't work out, are they comfortable going into the season with Robert Woods, Calvin Austin, Roman Wilson as their essential number 2 package next to DK Metcalf, much like they did last year with Van Jefferson, Calvin Austin, Roman Wilson as their number 2 package next to George Pickens? We have come up with as many realistic options as humanly possible. We have explained which ones can be real and which ones we expect not to be real. And Chris Olave's name has been floated out many, many times, but I think we have shut it down every single time. That is until today when 93.7 The Fans Adam Crawley tweeted out just a simple, got a text from somebody who's going to know, apparently. That text said Chris Olave. That was it. Then good old Nick Fairbaugh of Penn Live confirmed that the Pittsburgh Steelers have certainly called the New Orleans Saints looking for a wide receiver trade, or at least doing their due diligence here, saying, quote, in addition, sources tell Penn Live that New Orleans does not seem interested in trading Olave as of this morning. Nothing is close on a trade. However, I believe Tomlin. Oh, I apologize. That was the wrong one. Sources tell Penn Live that Steelers have called the Saints to check on Olave's availability. The Steelers are interested in the 24-year-old, but sources describe that call as due diligence. Due diligence on a 24-year-old wide receiver coming off 2,000-yard receiving seasons. Injuries last year that, derailed just about everything, but a strong start with questionable offensive weapons around him. Really no solid head coach throughout his entire time in New Orleans. The Saints are at a place where Derek Carr retires, Tyler Shuck's there, but nobody really knows if he's the answer. Is he going to be the answer? The Pittsburgh Steelers are a team that they don't know if they have the answer either, but they probably have Aaron Rodgers, which is an upgrade over Tyler Shuck, you'd have to imagine. Definitely an upgrade over Spencer Rattler. Spencer Rattler becomes the name to watch. Chris Olave, I mean, he's a guy that's entering the last year of his deal, is 24 years old, the same age that George Pickens was when the Steelers traded him. And, well, Olave went in the first round where George went in the second because, well, probably just as good of a player. Difference is that less character concerns. You look at Chris Olave, you look at Chris Olave's name, you look at the reports from Nick Fairbaugh and Adam Crawley, possibility? Are we beginning to heat up on the, okay, Pittsburgh Steelers have some interest on Chris Olave, and that is definitely something to keep an eye on? Or are you throwing immediate cold water on this bad boy and saying it ain't going to happen, we're getting our hopes up?
I am tossing a nice bucket of cold water onto this. I hate to be the bearer of bad news. I would love to add Chris Olave. I feel like of the two of us, I've probably been a little bit more optimistic about the Steelers' interest in him and potentially trying to get him. So I would love for them to be pursuing him for the right price. It doesn't seem likely. I do find the term due diligence to be a little right word, maybe not to describe the actions going on.
Yes.
But that being said, I don't think there's going to be anything major progressing with these talks. I expect them to kind of die down with the remaining time in the offseason here.
I hope you're wrong. I have a feeling that things are just at the beginning of this, but it shows me a couple of things. Okay. For one, it tells me that the Pittsburgh Steelers are interested in a wide receiver, that, they're not, everybody's kind of immediately jumping to, well, Calvin Austin, Roman Wilson, and they like what they have in house. They probably do like what they have in house, but they also liked George Pickens and they traded him. This is what they do. They're going to say all the right things. They're going to keep confidence in their guys, but they're going to constantly make phone calls and have conversations and see if things can change. And if they could find, quote unquote, their guy. And their guy right now might be Chris Olave. I think Chris Olave is the best name you could go get without question. If you could go get a guy where you get a 5th-year option, so you get 2 years of Chris Olave, then you got to sign him to a long-term deal. You don't know what the future holds, but if at 26 years old, the dude is a stud and wide receivers at that time, if Jamar Chase this year is getting paid $40 million a year, in 2 years, that means most guys are getting paid close to $40 million a year.
Mm-hmm.
Chris Olave, $40 million a year, maybe. $32 million a year, maybe. At that point, you got 2 wide receivers. That's a steal. No quarterback under contract, which is massive. I just think it works out if that's the way the Steelers want to approach it.
Mm-hmm.
There are differences, there are differences in approaching a Romeo Doubs or going after a Christian Watson or calling about an Allen Lazard and saying, this is a guy that fits this now. Maybe he fits it long-term, but maybe he doesn't fit it long-term. And then a Chris Olave where you're essentially saying, we wanted to keep DK and George. We didn't because of George.
Mm-hmm.
Chris might be the replacement to George Pickens. And that's the best outcome for the Pittsburgh Steelers. You have money, spend the money. You know what I mean? Go spend it on playmakers. You built your offensive line through the NFL draft. You got your starting running backs in Jaylen Warren and Caleb Johnson. You have your tight end crew. You have your wide receiver 1, and you have your depth wide receivers in Calvin Austin, Roman Wilson, and Robert Woods. You need a wide receiver 2. Go spend the money on a wide receiver 2. You don't have to worry about the massive contract for 2 seasons. At that point, maybe Minka's gone. Maybe Cam Hayward's gone. Maybe Alex Highsmith's at the end of his deal, and you're talking about that. Maybe DK's 2 years into his deal, and you're looking to move up. There's so many things. The possibilities are endless. I think Chris Olave makes way too much sense for the Steelers. Do I think that it's a realistic possibility? I mean, I don't know. Like we sit here today, what would you give up for a Chris Olave? If you're the Steelers, what are you willing to give up for a guy who's 20? He's going to be 25 years old, and by the start of the season, again, coming off of an injury, 5th-year option picked up, and has 2,000-yard receiving seasons in 3 years.
My initial question regarding this whole topic is, could the Steelers conceivably go out and make a deal for a wide receiver that exceeds what they got in return for George Pickens? And at first I thought they can't do that, right? If they could only get a 3rd and a later round pick swap for George Pickens, the most that they could then go spend on a wide receiver to replace him in the number 2 position would be, a 3rd round pick and a late round pick swap. But then the key factor in making me change my mind here is that extra year, the 5th-year option. And I think at that point, I would be willing to give up a 2nd rounder. I know we just did it for DK Metcalf, and you can easily make the argument, well, are you, is that the same sort of value? Did you give up a little too much? I think you maybe have already put yourself in a situation where you have to give up a little bit more than you would want to because you don't have the leverage to get the actual player that is the best fit. So if Olave is absolutely the Steelers' top to bottom, management, Tomlin are all super gung-ho on him, then I think a 2nd round pick, maybe, you swap some picks in the 7th, 6th.
Yeah.
Sure. But yeah, I would be willing to go there. Because again, you have the cap space to do it. I think this would be the time to go after that player, but it has to be like the actual right player. I don't just want Mike Williams coming in and overspending for that, or even just a quality wide receiver at that point.
Yeah.
You can't overspend. It has to be someone who is like a good fit for years to come as well.
I agree. Like you have the possibility right now to say this is how the Steelers should be thinking in my eyes. This is my opinion. I'm sure if I laid this one out for Omar, he'd agree 100%, no questions asked. And Mike Tomlin too. They tell me, genius, you want to run the Pittsburgh Steelers starting right now? I'd say, yeah, no doubt about it, pal. Pretty much been doing it. You guys just haven't been listening to the pod. If I'm the Pittsburgh Steelers, I create the package that I'm willing to give up for next year to go get a quarterback. That's what I'm doing right now. I'm saying, all right, we're willing to give up a 1st round pick, a 3rd round pick, the 1st after that, and maybe a 2nd, 3rd if need be, and then a bunch of little guys. That's what we're willing to give up to go get our quarterback. That's what the Steelers should be doing first, because you need a quarterback. You can't. The Steelers' priority 1 from now until they have one is to get a franchise quarterback, and it should not change whatsoever. Once you have that package down, then you start to evaluate what you could do with the rest of it, because the Steelers are in a place where they don't need a bunch of flaws or a bunch of holes filled. They have a good roster. They have a roster built right now where they could plug guys in and fill other draft picks, but also free agency and those kinds of things where you're not taking massive risks. You're not band-aiding major holes anymore. You've done those things. You've put the time and the effort into them. Okay. Are we willing? Does the quarterback package plus the minor tweaks we're going to have to make in 2026 add up to us still being able to give up a second round pick to the Saints for Chris Olave? Can we give them a third and a fifth and still make it work? Whatever that package is, but that's how I'm looking at it, is if the Pittsburgh Steelers want a quarterback, go get that quarterback in a year, and then everything else you have, everything else you expect to have, you could do to put everything else in place. And if that means going to get a wide receiver right now, and that wide receiver is Chris Olave, and it costs a second round pick, that means go get Chris Olave for a second round pick. At the same time, though, what do you think the Saints are on? Like, the Saints apparently want something ridiculous. You can only imagine. Do they want a first for Chris Olave? And do you budge? Like, if you're the Saints, at some point, you got to be sitting here thinking, all right, guys, let's just sit down and be realistic about the situation. Mm-hmm. Our quarterback's 45 and a rookie, okay? The guy who was supposed to be playing quarterback didn't want to play quarterback, said his elbow or his shoulder hurt, took a page right out of the Deshaun Watson, I tore my Achilles 15 times notebook to say, I'm done, guys. This isn't going to happen this year. Probably not a Super Bowl contender. Could probably use picks to stack up for the future. If that's the case, maybe, just maybe, they're willing to give up a guy like Chris Olave to a team that's a little bit closer. What's the price in your eyes from the Saints? Like, what are the Saints telling the Steelers that they got to give up for Chris Olave?
A lot. And right now the Saints hold all of the leverage in any of these potential conversations. So I think that they would be holding out for a first round pick right now. They have essentially 2.5 years to get some sort of return or figure out a contract for Chris Olave. That, doesn't really bode well for the Steelers being like, here's a third and a fifth. So I think it puts the Saints in this position of being like, well, you can either wow us with an offer. And if I were the Saints, if I were the GM for the Saints, if I could get a first round pick and maybe some sort of swap or anything else that might help the organization for Chris Olave, I would be very inclined to take that deal. And I think for right now, for the next couple of months, maybe once, the season starts and the schedule starts shaking out differently, if the Saints are losers, it changes the leverage they might have. But for now, I'm saying you got to blow me away with the package to get him off the Saints.
See, that stinks for the Steelers, man, because I think that it just makes too much sense. I'll say, my thoughts on the Chris Olave situation is it works out so well for Pittsburgh. If they can do it, I support it. I have no issues with the Chris Olave consideration, due diligence, phone call, whatever you want to call it. I think the Pittsburgh Steelers made the right move. They're making the right move by looking at Chris Olave and saying, this is the guy we should be going after. This is the guy that, makes us a better team, makes us contender worthy if we get the right quarterback, sets our quarterback up a year from now to win. I mean, that's what you've essentially done. That's what they would be doing, is saying George Pickens was great, man, and whoever comes in next year to be our quarterback would have had a great 1-2 punch, but would have had a great 1-2 punch. They would have had to babysat at least one of those guys. You don't have to do that with Chris Olave. And I think that changes everything in the terms of wide receivers and who you would get for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Where does he rank on realistically ending up in Pittsburgh this season compared to the Romeo Doubs and the Wicks and the Allen Lazards and the Amari Coopers and the, nobody, because Calvin Austin's that guy.
I have like two sort of columns I'm putting in potential targets for the second wide receiver position in Pittsburgh. The one is trade targets, and Chris Olave is definitely number one in terms of realistic options. And I couch that all with I place this caveat on all of the trade options that I feel less and less likely with each passing day that another trade for a wide receiver is going to happen. And then I have this other column of free agent wide receiver targets that I feel like in general are much more likely. So someone like an Amari Cooper or something like that, probably in my mind still right now a free agent like an Amari Cooper, not saying him specifically, but a veteran sort of along those lines, meeting that description is the most likely option to come in for the Steelers. I would have, so that would put him like, I don't know, like maybe like third, fourth, fifth in that. Yeah. I don't think a trade's going to happen right now. I don't feel convinced of that today.
Do you think that a trade could happen at what point in the offseason does it become more realistic to you? Like, what point in the offseason do we get to a place where you're going, yeah, maybe I'm going to start thinking about a trade here and the Steelers actually pulling this off?
I think, and this might sound obvious, but once the quarterback position is resolved one way or the other, if there is a definitive day where, Mason Rudolph is the starting quarterback for the 2025 season, then it's like, okay, well, maybe it makes the most sense to get another weapon for Mason Rudolph. But I think they need to know who's going to be under center first, and then you can kind of go from there. So maybe in like a month, maybe.
Maybe in a month when Aaron Rodgers finally decides to answer, the Steelers could start thinking about their wide receiver position and just say, all right, well, there's checkbox 1. Let's see what the other roster looks like. The rest of the roster looks like with the 11 days we have before training camp. That sounds great. That's so brutal.
Do you think that the more likely conversation, like what's being weighed in the Steelers front office, is not, trade free agent or trade waiting for the domino of the quarterback to fall, but is it worth allocating any more future assets to try and improve the roster for 2025? Is that worth our time at this point? Or is it just, I know Omar Khan is probably like the best at like testing the market, making those calls, doing due diligence, but is the debate like, oh, we need to know if Rodgers is coming, then we can keep negotiating for the trade market? Or is it like, do we even think it's worth our time to be doing this in 2025?
I look at it and say the Pittsburgh Steelers should be looking for a wide receiver. If it's the right wide receiver, they should be looking for a wide receiver either. You don't sign Aaron Rodgers and say, all right, well, we don't really need another wide receiver right now. We don't need a great team around him. We just, no, at that point, roll with Mason Rudolph, accept 7 wins, 6 wins, 5 wins, and be cool with it. If that's what it is if you're tank mode, don't go get a wide receiver. But the Steelers are not in tank mode. They're going after a 4-time MVP that they are literally trying to convince and beg on their knees for him to leave Malibu and come to Pittsburgh in the middle of the spring to do something he hasn't done in 10 years. To say, come on, dude, just 1 OTA practice, please. Minicamp, this is 3 days. We'll fly you out here. We'll pay for the flights, get you a nice hotel room. It'll be fine. Like at that point, you're saying, okay, we're looking to win. And if you're looking to win, you go get a guy. The only way you trade for a wide receiver in my eyes is if you get a guy that fits the bill now and later. And Chris Olave fits the bill now and later, because it's not about what you do this year. You're going to try this year, but if it makes sense next year as well, then it makes sense. Because if it makes sense next year to say, here's another weapon for the rookie that's going to start, awesome. That's where I stand with it. Is I'm okay with adding assets right now as long as they're like the Steelers again walk this weird line right now of like now and later. And I don't care about now as long as it's good for later. And I think Chris Olave does that. And I don't think that you'd give up. You'd have to walk that line again, but I don't think you'd give up enough to say, oh, we just hurt ourselves moving forward. I think they'd be in a pretty good spot, to be honest, if they were to give up a 2nd round pick and say, all right, Chris Olave, here you go. Sounds good. Obviously health concerns, a lot of concussions, but if everything else works out, pretty good.